That was the sarabande from the second French suite by Johann Sebastian Bach. And I'm starting today's lecture with this performance so that we can review a little bit of what we discussed last class, which was about the late Baroque period. Now, I know that there are a lot of new faces as well as some familiar faces that were here last week. We covered mostly historical facts about what happened during what we call the Baroque period, which was somewhere between 1720 and 1750, the late Baroque period. And we, due to the constraints of time, very briefly covered on the stylistic tendencies of the late Baroque period. We mustn't forget the fact that during the Baroque period, music was becoming what we know today. And one of the things that was being established was harmony. We talked a little bit about the concept of tonic and dominant coming in place. Just to review, the concept of tonic and dominant, for example, in the key of C major, tonic is when you're feeling comfortable. In the case of C major, this would be C major. Dominant, which is built on the fifth chord of the scale, is the opposite feeling, where it's a feeling of discomfort which beckons resolving. This concept wasn't really around until about the beginning of the early Baroque period, which was 1600s. The Renaissance masters had some sense of it, but it wasn't really established. Now, that being said, of course, people didn't really still know how to really clarify, or didn't care to clarify, the feeling of this, what we call cadence, dominant going to tonic. And as you could hear in the musical example that I opened the class with, it isn't very clear where the phrase ended and where it started. I'll play a little bit of it one more time. Kept going, even though we did have C minor chord, which is tonic. Now we're meandering. So on and so forth. So with Baroque era, you could assume that the opulence of expression was more important than having very clear-cut phrases. Classical era is when that changes. And this is roughly around 1750, when the style called the gallant style rises. The gallant style. Gallant means happy, lighthearted. And in exchange of complex emotions and feelings, which are often heightened by the fact that one mood will be the focus of one piece, people started finding ways to express many moods within a piece, but in a very clear-cut way, so that you could definitely feel this is sad, and then suddenly it's happy, and then it's like confused, and then it's dramatic, so on and so forth. So those constant changes of dramatic expressions within a very clear-cut phrases, and also to use very clear-cut harmonic progression to make that even clearer. We call this the gallant style. And one of the interesting things about history is that nothing is ever certain. So when the style was changing, of course, it was changing very slowly. So one of the composers that I ran out of time for last time was a man named Domenico Scarlatti. And I'd like to play an excerpt of his sonata. To show you how the style starts to change a little. This is his sonata number 380. He wrote 555 sonatas, which is quite prolific. Notice some interesting mixture of styles. First of all, it's still very opulent. It's still very much full of decorations. There are many notes decorating this music, but at the same time, you notice that the character is constantly changing. You began with but then by the middle point of this first section was just sort of a fanfare, right? Totally different. And then a few measures later, he has again a different mood. Later, the fanfare comes back, but very clearly. It's of his putting, okay, borderline here, this is new stuff now. This is a characteristic often found in what we call classical period. So, classical period that lasted roughly between the deaths of Bach and Beethoven, we saw a lot of changes in society as well in Europe. This was, of course, the time when the great nation that is the United States was born, and this was a time of what we call the Age of Enlightenment. Is everyone familiar with this term? Age of Enlightenment. Just to make it a gross generalization, this was a time when a great deal of science was being developed, and people, instead of relying on belief systems, try to rely on science and logic to answer everything. And the reason why America was born was because, well, we've been told forever that kings are better than us, but when I look at them scientifically, they're still humans. So why should they be better than we? So hence why a bunch of angry Bostonians, of course, uprose and this country was born. This is, as a result, the power of the hierarchy starts to shift in Europe. By that I mean kings and princes don't have as much power. In Baroque period, a composer who was hired by a very powerful man, say a prince or a count, could ask all musicians of the town to play in his or her music. Often it would be him. And such a thing was no longer possible with this new change in the social structure. Because of this, but because the counts and princes and the aristocrats of Europe wanted to hold on to their luxuries, began hiring musicians for their own personal enjoyment. But because they didn't have the kind of money to pull everybody in town, they started hiring much smaller ensembles to stay in their palaces. So instead of having a massive work done, often it was chamber music, a smaller scale symphonies. And with that need for a smaller group of people playing, instrumental playing really changed a great deal. I have to go into, this is very difficult to explain 70 years of change within 45 minutes, but one of the things that Baroque composers used to do is not really say exactly which instrument should play in the orchestra. In other words, they would write something like 4 melodies. They would create harmony, but not really necessarily say which instruments would play which line. And that was totally up to the concertmaster, who would be the first violinist of the group, to say, okay, you guys, the oboe and the flute and the violin play the first line, and you guys play the second line, so on and so forth. So it was just random. Every performance of the piece would be changed as a result. And only when the composer would write on the score the word obbligato, which means obligated, only then a specific instrument would be used for that line. But since starting from classical period, such thing was not really possible because you didn't have such huge pool of musicians. The composer had to specify every line, say which line is played by which instrument, because they only had probably about 6 instruments, and they say, okay, these instruments have to play that line. And they would have to line, because now they knew exactly which instrument would play that line, they would also specify exactly how to play that note, or how to connect. Or certain notes wouldn't be played because an oboe, for example, couldn't play the note, so on and so forth. So what does that mean? Notation becomes a lot more specific. Notation meaning writing down music becomes a lot more exact. And with that, there was a care for how something felt comfortable to the hand. This was something that wasn't really cared for. I'm sure the pianists out there who played a fugue by Bach would attest that it's not comfortable. Bach is saying, here are 4 voices, good luck, figure it out. But with the composers that come in the classical period realm, it's not like that anymore. And besides, they were also great instrument players, and they would write to show off their abilities on the keyboard. There was a rise for comic opera for general people. Opera was something that was for the privileged, but now that there was a greater interest among the general public to enjoy the opera also, but they wouldn't sit down for a very serious opera about a mythological figure. There was a need for comic opera. So this is when composer that we'll talk about, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, would write so many operas that were in nature funny, such as Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, so on and so forth. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I must talk about this in relationship with the instrument choices and whatnot. Mozart was a unique case in his life because unlike most musicians at the time, he wanted to freelance. The concept of freelancing is that you're writing not for a specific lord or king or prince, but that you're writing for the people. And that meant that he was clamoring to what was popular at the time. But that meant that he had to hire everybody himself to play his concerts. So often, he would write music that would take one rehearsal to put together. So many of you might have noticed that Mozart's music tends to be a lot simpler on the page. It's easier to learn. That's because they had one rehearsal to put it together. And if you put a lot of stuff in there, there's no way that could be prepared in time. And we know this because often in letters by Mozart, he said, okay, at the rehearsal, we'll talk about this. It's never during the rehearsals. So that's something, just a little fun fact to know. So let's see, stylistic changes. Let's return to that. And with that, I'd like to introduce one of the two main composers I want to talk about today. A man named Joseph Haydn. Has everybody heard of his name? Everybody familiar with Joseph Haydn? His full name is, of course, Franz Joseph Haydn. Franz Joseph Haydn was an Austrian composer who's not given enough credit, in my opinion. Haydn was born in Austria, and he was educated as a member of the chorister for the imperial choir at the St. Stephen's Church in Vienna. But when his voice cracked, as is the tragic case for men, they said, well, your voice is not good enough anymore, so you have to leave. In fact, the story goes that the Empress Maria Theresa said Haydn's singing was like listening to a pig cry when his voice cracked. So if the Empress said no more, he's definitely out. So he was kicked out. And we're not quite sure exactly what happened for a while with him, but it is assumed that he took music lessons staying in Vienna, somehow making means. And we hear from him again when he's roughly about 20 years old or so, when he is hired by a man named Prince Nicolaus Esterhazy. He was a nobleman, a prince, that inherited the region which is now Hungary, called Esterháza, quite about an hour and a half away from Vienna, to the southeast of Vienna. And for about 35 years or so, Haydn lives in this castle, writing music for the prince. And because he was so isolated from the main scene of music of Vienna, he developed his own unique style. The prince was a great lover of music, so he had actually a huge troupe of musicians under his command, a full orchestra, a set of singers, a choir, so that he could have brand new masses written for him for Sundays. And the contract, which I cannot remember exact, the contract that Haydn signed when he was first hired, required that he write something like 2 operas, 6 masses, 13, 14, 15 sonatas for different instruments and symphonies and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a lot of work. Not to mention that Haydn was then also required to make sure that the musicians were well fed, well dressed, and they would behave. And if they weren't behaving, then it was Haydn's job to iron out the drama, so on and so forth. And Haydn particularly enjoyed this job, and he enjoyed the patronage of the prince, who was just so much fond of Haydn's style. And while he was working under the Esterhazy family, he developed what is now known as the symphonic form. Does everybody know what I mean by symphonic form? Okay, for those of you who's having a hard time, symphony is something that is written for the orchestra, right? And it is really nothing more than a sonata for the symphony. Okay? Is everybody familiar with the term sonata? We covered it very briefly. Sonata form becomes very important in classical era. So we should digress for a second and talk a little bit about the sonata form. Sonata, something which began in the Baroque period, as is evident with Scarlatti writing 555 sonatas in his life. Sonata is a form in which music is organized. And this is quintessentially a classical form because the idea is that you have 2 main melodies that could be developed harmonically, so that what you're doing is you have melody 1 and melody 2, during which you go from key A to key B. And eventually, those 2 melodies will come back, but your key will not change. But before you get there, you end up with a section that is very dramatically confusing and harmonically confusing. I will write this, but I don't think it's necessary to remember all of this. The sections which I'm referring to are known as exposition, development, and recap. Okay. So here is the notion of clarity in form. You see, very different from Baroque era. You have 2 melodies. Melodic simplicity, clarity, harmonic development that is clearly defined by cadences. And then multiple changes of keys using the terms of principles of cadences to end up in interesting places that eventually returns to what is the same thing as the beginning, and staying in the same key but listening to those melodies one more time. This is what we call sonata form. And in my personal opinion, this is the greatest form that the Western Europe invented. I think it's really logically built, and it's been perfected by many great masters. Mozart, Beethoven, particularly with his 32 piano sonatas, which we'll talk about in the next class. But Haydn was the one to use this sonata form and turn it into a symphonic form, to use multiple instruments to take that form to new level. And he was also instrumental in expanding the orchestra as a result, which is a whole story, but I will stop there with regards to that. So let me just very quickly, I have a couple guests here to perform today. Let me just quickly play a sonata that he definitely would have written for Esterhazy. This is sonata in C major. I'll just play a part of that. And you will see a great deal of change in style. You hear the difference in the style very much. The melody is simple. That was a 4-measure phrase. 4-measure phrase. 4 plus 4. Very easy to understand. And to make the melody really come out, dominant. Tonic. None of the complicated, brooding Baroque style anymore. It's very simple. Mozart comes to mind next. And with that, we'll definitely have Caitlin come in. Amadeus Mozart, another Austrian composer. You can notice that the age difference is pretty significant between the two. 1732, 1756. There's 24 years of age difference. It's a whole generation, really. But you see, Haydn was just so far away from the main scene of music, brewing, so to speak, his own style, that he was not really taken, he wasn't really noticed until about the 1780s. And this is really convenient in a sense because Mozart was from a remote town of Salzburg, which is quite far away from Vienna, had just moved into Vienna in 1780. And having seen Haydn's way of writing, and having been, of course, a great famous prodigy, touring all over Europe, absorbing with his amazing musical ability, absorbing different styles, when he saw Haydn's style of writing music, he thought, aha, this wonderful new galant style that I could absorb also, but I'm gonna elaborate on that more. So what I'd like to do, so how does he elaborate? He elaborates by putting a lot more melodies. His sonata forms are a little different than other people because he wouldn't just have two melodies. He'll put 3, 4, 5 melodic fragments because he likes tunes. Second thing that he does is he makes the chord progressions a lot juicier, for the lack of a better term, meaning that he uses a lot of chromatic lines to embellish on it. This is partly due to the fact that Mozart was one of the few people that knew of Bach's music, studied Bach's music, and it influenced him. So with that, I'd like to invite Caitlin to play for us the second movement of the piano sonata, correct? 332? Correct. Your chair high enough? Are you comfortable? notice how, as you're listening, if you're listening very carefully, you might have noticed that you might have heard the same melody twice, right? So that's what you're going through. You're going through the first theme and second theme, coming back to you, but in the original key of B flat major. So that was beautiful. Did you also notice how, harmonically speaking, there were some moments where you were like, where are we right now? So we started in B flat major, but at one point he goes to B flat minor, which back then was a pretty big deal because you're jumping several key signatures, yeah, which was not done very often. This is known as using the tonic, modulating to a relevant, keeping the same tonic note. Now, due to the time, we have to invite now William to come out and play. He's going to play for us the first movement of the first piano concerto by Beethoven, whom we'll talk a lot more about next time. How does Beethoven fit into this? We talked about how Haydn sort of initiated, as far as the piano style goes, sort of that galant style. Mozart was inspired by this and then did his own twist by using melodies and harmony. Beethoven is a man of motives, which is different from melody, in that whereas in Mozart's melody just kind of continues on like in linear fashion, Beethoven likes to deal with small cell of musical idea. So, William, would you agree with me that this is heard all the time?
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
That is the motive. And boy, is it simple. C, 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 C. And he just said the whole time. And this is found in the most famous piece, perhaps, by Beethoven, which is the motives again, 4 notes. Same. Whole symphony built on that. I'm deliberately changing it so you can hear. You notice how everything is just exactly that cell. So, first concerto. To hear our young Beethoven explore this gallant style. Could I ask Myra if you could turn pages for me? Thank you. I'll start from the very beginning. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Stop here. It's not the entire movement, but unfortunately we'll have to cut it short. So, quick word about concerto, then we can call it a day today. So if you remember, with the Baroque era concerto, it was known as concerto grosso, which meant that multiple instruments would be performing as soloists along with the orchestra or against the orchestra. But the notion of that changes probably due to the popular demand to become solo concerto, where one instrument is featured, although it's not always the case. Often there's a preference of solo concerto over concertos of multiple solo instruments, which is more Baroque era. So this is the example that you see here, where Beethoven is showcasing really himself, who would have been at the piano with the orchestra. Thank you very much. To be continued with Beethoven next week, in next 2 weeks. Thank you.